Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pinot and Policy, where we have conversations about government policy, politics, along with some wine and levity mixed in. I am one of your co hosts, Rafe D'Amico. I'm joined here by your other co host, Eric Settle, former candidate for Attorney General. And we like to think that we bring interesting perspectives to these topics. As a boomer, that's Eric, in case you were wondering, and a Gen Xer, that's me. We try to find commonalities as well as differences so that we can explore these issues together. And our hope is that we can have civil discourse on what at times can be contentious topics so that we can better understand each other, our community, the United States, and of course, the world. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Eric, who is going to present our topics for today, and we will get started. How's it going?
Great, thanks. Hey, Rafe, thanks. How you doing this week?
Doing pretty well. Doing pretty well, thanks.
The fun thing about doing this once a week is that we get to marinate whatever happened the week before. And so we get to see what happens week to week rather than day to day, because frankly, the last, 35, 36 days of the new Trump administration has just been a fire hose.
I'm just trying to catch my breath. I mean, we could do an episode on a daily basis and we'd have plenty of content.
We do, but the advantage of doing it weekly is we have a little bit of perspective from the week before, and we'll talk about that topic. So today, we've talked a lot about policy, but we haven't really talked a lot about Pinot. So we're going to start out today talking a little bit about wine and the issue of value, because I think that's one of the most important issues related to wine, which is finding a wine you like at a price you can afford.
I like that. I mean, hey, if inflation keeps ticking up the way people expect it to, my discretionary income is getting, I have to be more and more judicious and discerning with how I spend it and the wines I choose.
No, that's fair. And then we're going to talk, speaking of inflation, we're going to talk about Elon Musk, who is trying to reduce inflation, but I'm not sure by firing large chunks of the federal government and creating all sorts of uncertainty is really helping with the economy or with our federal government providing the necessary services that we all have come to rely upon.
Yeah, I might have to pour myself a drink for that one.
Yeah. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Donald Trump and Ukraine. Interesting developments in the last week, kind of a war words between the president and the president of Ukraine. And as we speak on today, which is the 26th of February,
It is a 26.
it does seem like some progress is being made in the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine and the United States. Then I'm going to talk a little about Josh Shapiro, our governor, and how he has used his charm and his willingness to work across the aisle to help Pennsylvania with both a carrot and a stick. And then if we have time, we'll talk about some other fun things. So let's get started.
Let's get started. We're going to talk about wine.
Right. So we always feel like wine gets shunted to the end. So we're going to talk about it at the beginning. And as I was saying, is the whole thing is trying to find a wine that meets your budget and your palate. And if you think about it, if you draw like a chart, there is sort of how good a wine is and how expensive a wine is. And I always call this kind of the wine yield chart that says that as a wine gets more expensive, it does taste better. But at some point, as it gets more expensive, it doesn't taste that much more better.
You get diminishing returns, so to speak, on the money that you're putting into the wine versus the better quality and better taste that you're getting in return.
Right. So we all know that a $10 bottle of wine tastes better than a $5 bottle of wine. And generally speaking, a $15 bottle of wine does in fact taste better than a $10 bottle of wine. But as you go up to 20 and 40 and 50 and 100, it flattens. In other words, it's sort of like, and I know in my experiences, I've had the privilege of trying wines that are, say, $100. And they are really good, okay? But they're not 3 times as good as the $30 bottle of wine that you just go, wow, this is delicious.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. It's rare that you get that same level of return on the price that you're getting in the quality. So if somebody is relatively new to wine and trying to figure out this scale and the ratio, what are some good tips that you would maybe give them?
Well, I think one of the things, I think I've said this before, is that, the outside rating systems, okay, while not perfect, and Wine Spectator and Wine Enthusiast and Jeb Dunnick and Robert Parker. There's probably, 10 or 15 rating services that rate wine. And so the first thing is sort of when you see a wine at a certain price, see if it has some independent rating. Because one of the things in Pennsylvania is you often see deeply discounted wine, but it doesn't have an independent rating. And what I've discovered with those is those are really not great wines from well-known winemakers who are seeking to get rid of inventory and therefore, slashing a $70 bottle is now 20.
Yeah, you're talking about the quote unquote chairman's selection, which is just the state appointed buyer, really. We're just talking about someone who's a bulk buyer of wine in Pennsylvania. I think is like something like the second largest buyer of wine in the country. So they certainly get discounts on volume. But as you just said, the danger in that is that they're dealing in distressed inventory or that otherwise wouldn't be getting consumed, that they're getting at a drastic discount. And while that's great and nice for the Pennsylvania consumer, you might not be getting the best quality wine. And at the end of the day, there's marketing that goes into all this, right?
Right. But unless those wines, and a number of those wines do have, Best Buy or value wine, there's somebody other than the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board saying, buy this wine. So that's, yeah.
Yeah. So for example, like most people are familiar with Napa Valley, right?
Okay.
Napa Valley is very known for its big, bold reds, especially its cabs, its Cabernet Sauvignons. And the price of real estate is expensive out in Napa Valley. The price of labor is also really expensive in California. So all of that price is baked into the cost of the wine. And then on top of it, you're talking about one of the more prestigious wine regions in the country. So they have the ability to command some higher prices because at the end of the day, there is that, good old supply and demand aspect that goes into wine and pricing. And consumers, not only in the US, but all around the world, they want to drink Napa Cabs. They want, like steakhouses, love a big Napa Cabernet Sauvignon with a strip steak or what have you. What's your choice? So if somebody loves a Napa Cab and they don't want to pay a Napa Cab price, what's a good alternative?
Well, so go over the valley to the next valley called Sonoma. Sonoma is, it's the next valley over. And if you've ever been out to wine country, there's a road that connects them. You go over the mountain and you come down the other side and you're in the Sonoma Valley. And so there you can get a cab that's just as tasty for, a third the price because the real estate in Sonoma is not as expensive as the real estate in Napa.
A little less expensive, still expensive. And then I think, if you look at the state as a whole, California, because you have parts of Sonoma like Russian River Valley, really known for its Pinot Noir as well as its Chardonnay. And yes, they're growing some good cab out in Sonoma too. Still now, on the more expensive side. You go further south to say Santa Barbara, Southern California. That area, was made very famous by an indie film about wine. The name's escaping me right now, but
Sideways.
Thank you. Yeah, Paul Giamatti. They're a little bachelor party. They get into some trouble, and Giamatti's character is just this major wine enthusiast who loves his Pinot Noir, and you can get some fantastic Pinot Noir in Santa Barbara, but you're starting to see the prices go up. What's interesting is if you look at the whole state, you go in between Northern California, Napa, Sonoma, and Southern California, the Santa Barbara area, Paso Robles, little less of a known wine region, but producing in Central California, producing some really interesting like GSM wines, which are like your Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedres, very similar in characteristic to Southern Rhone wines.
Correct.
They are making some really, really nice, elegant wines at much lower price points.
At much lower prices. Actually, I'll tell you a funny story about Sideways. And I've actually read some research on this. So there were scenes in that movie where Paul Giamatti made it clear that he did not like Merlot.
No. Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Right. And as a result of that one line in the movie,
Merlot
Merlot
wine sales.
demand really dropped.
They did. They did. It was literally the sideways effect, and Merlot wine sales took a hit not only in that year, but for like subsequent years after.
For because that movie's now probably 15 years old, and of
Yeah.
course the irony someone pointed out in the same article, and at the same time, Pinot Noir suddenly became more popular because that was a grape that they discussed in that movie that he was very into, and his romantic Virginia Madsen was playing his romantic partner in this, and kind of the making Pinot Noir sort of this poetic amazing thing, and it was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, I
But
remember the scene. It's like he's talking about how delicate and thin the grape is, and
yes,
it has to be like just right. And it's kind of analogous to like his character and how sensitive he is. Him being in love with Pinot Noir makes his romantic female counterpart fall in love with him because of how in love he is with the Pinot Noir.
right. But which is part of the comedy is he doesn't pick up on any of these cues. Like she's incredibly impressed with him, and he's an author, or he's a school teacher that's trying to write a novel. He sort of misses those cues in the movie. We're not going to give it all away, but the irony of the movie is that at the very end, and I don't want to give it away, but I guess we will. He has this prize bottle of Cheval Blanc. This very expensive Bordeaux. One that's probably hundreds of dollars a bottle that he's been sort of saving for a special occasion, and in a kind of a fit of anger because he found out that his ex-wife, who he still loved, had gotten remarried. He goes to like an In-N-Out burger or a Shake Shack type place and is drinking his prize wine in a styrofoam cup. And the irony, of course, is that for those of us, those important Bordeaux's are a large chunk of them are Merlot. So it's
Yes.
actually
Yeah, if it's a left bank Bordeaux, it's going to be predominantly Merlot. A right bank is going to be predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon. Yes, there is a fun little twist of irony there. So
but yeah, but in
yeah,
you're good.
it's it's a great movie, highly recommended. And I think the theme here that we're getting to with value is if you identify a prominent, high quality, prestigious area that commands a high price point, a little trick is just being familiar with the geography and going to an adjacent region. And that can be, you can look at that on a couple different levels, right, Eric? Like you can look at that as like an adjacent region, like we talked about with Napa and Sonoma, or you can look at it by an adjacent vineyard. So if
Right.
there's a very prominent vineyard or chateau in, let's say, Bordeaux, like if you have like a Mouton, you can look at a neighboring vineyard, or in Bordeaux, you can look at a neighboring village. And like I think a good little pivot here is we were talking about Southern Rhone and Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre, the GSM wines, which is really what is those are some grapes that grow really well in Southern Rhone. And one of the more prominent sub-regions in Southern Rhone is a Chateauneuf du Pape, which is one of my favorite wines. It comprises 13 different grapes up to that can be blended. And I think it's like a minimum of 6 years really before you can enjoy it. So just the aging factor goes into this being a kind of expensive wine. But Eric, in your experience, you've managed to find a little hack there.
Right. The next town up the river is called Gingoda. Looks like kind of Gigandus. And those wines are as good, okay? Maybe not, look, I agree with you. Chateauneuf du Papes are amazing, but half the price, and you get so much better value. And you go up another village, it's Carrian. And it's interesting, you look at kind of maps. The truth is that in France particularly, all these wines are kind of named after the town they're in. In other words, the grapes are the same. It's what town did they come from? And so that's another good example. And I think part of it too is, when you go to a restaurant and you want to order wine, and I'm sure you have the same experience. I mean, you go to a restaurant now, you want to order a bottle of wine, you have real sticker shock. I mean, it's
I mean,
scary.
it's where the restaurants make their money. You're going to see a text, sometimes a text multiple as far as what you would see a retail price versus what you're going to pay for it in a restaurant, which is great that Philadelphia is one of the cities that is well known for its BYOs. So you can
Right.
put your own bottle in. Like I think one last comment I'll share before we pivot away from wine, because I'll share with everybody one of my favorite value wines. And value is definitely a relative term, right? So talk about French wines and just how well known they are. And Burgundy is one of the more prominent, well known regions of France, some of the best Pinot Noir in the world. And you can get real specific with the villages there, whether it's the Côte de Rhône or the Côte de Nuit. Côte de Nuit is where most of Côte de Rhône, sorry. So,
It's Côte de
yeah,
Nuit
sorry.
and
Côte
Côte d'Or,
Nuit and
Côte de Beaune.
Bon, thank you. So you're going to have the sub villages there, which produce some great Pinot Noirs, right? And if you look at the topography of how that region is, how Burgundy is, and even the longitudinal line and the weather pattern, it is very similar to a little region in Oregon called Willamette Valley, which
Right.
is they are, in my opinion, some of the best producers of Pinot Noir, not only in the US, but the world. And one of my favorite producers there is Flaneur. And if you have a chance to drink their Pinot Noir, I highly recommend it. They also make a Gamay, which is another grape. One of the few other red grapes that are produced in Burgundy is Gamay. And similar to the Burgundian winemakers, they kind of follow suit in Willamette Valley, especially this winery, Flaneur. Again, highly recommend it. Flaneur is a French word for someone who just kind of casually walks without real purpose. You're just kind of smelling and taking in the roses. Casual walk without a destination. Great way to enjoy a wine. So highly recommend it.
All right.
I might even, when we get into some of these topics, Eric, I might even pop this bottle open. We'll see.
Well, I must tell you, I suggested, we do these from separate studios, but I suggested we do this together, and now he pulls out the good wine.
Yeah,
So
you're missing
anyway.
out. And just for the record, I believe this is like a $40 bottle of wine, which,
Okay.
you know, all things considered, you get this in a restaurant, it might be anywhere between $80 and $100. So if you can get this direct from the winery and they will ship, you're getting great value. It will age, but it's also something you can drink right now.
Okay. Well, speaking of drinking right now, let's talk about what's going on in our world.
Please.
And so I guess we'll start with, the sub president, Elon Musk, who this week, last week, I guess, began the process of, firing probationary employees. And this week, he, on Saturday night, he announced and sent out to everybody, all federal employees, a basic email that says, send me 5 bullet points of what you did last week. And if you don't, you're going to get fired. And, there was a huge uproar in everywhere about this. And I must tell you, though, I am not a fan of almost anything Elon Musk is doing. I don't think it's terribly unfair to say to an employee once a week, give me five things you did this week.
So,
And what do you think?
I mean, Elon has come out and said he is just misunderstood, right? And that this ask was maybe misunderstood, and that what they're really talking about here is a pulse test. Like, is there somebody that is actually behind this email and this worker and this paycheck? And of course, this is being done under the banner of saving taxpayers' money. And, in theory, right? Like, in theory, who wouldn't want to make sure that every government worker is not only working and present and accountable, but giving 100% of their effort to that one job? And I don't know how much truth there is to this, but there was some concern that, well, maybe some of these workers are doing more than one job, especially if they are a remote worker. Then maybe they are doing 2 remote jobs, which has been done, not just in the government side of things, but there are plenty of private sector employees who, and I know some firsthand, that have been working two jobs, getting two paychecks. Some have done it for a long time, some get caught. There are some checks and balances. But I think there is this paranoia, and I don't know if this is the only thing, that, are these people working? It's a quick pulse check. Are they doing two jobs? And very quickly, like, hey, what are five things that you did last week? Not even really an accountability and a productivity test, but really just a pulse check.
Right. And it's interesting because one of the things we finally saw is I would say a little separation from the cabinet. So a number of the agencies said, please do not comply with that. Some of the agencies said, please comply. And then in this sort of interesting moment that no doubt will be encapsulated on Saturday Night Live this week, the president said, well, if you don't do it, you will either be semi-fired or fired.
What does semi-fired mean?
What is semi-fired? Is it like medium rare? Is that medium rare?
I don't know, but this wine smells delicious. If anybody's actually watching and not just listening, this Pinot 2021 has a great color on it, Eric.
Well, it's funny. It took us 6 episodes in dry January to get to a little bit of Pinot on Pinot and Policy. So thank you.
And here we are. And here we are.
So going back to so I hear what you're saying about that. As someone who's supervised people, the idea of having a weekly report that says, what you do this week is important. I think, again, like everything else that they're doing, it's draconian. So you've got one day to do it. And if you don't, you're fired. And I think, again, this is part of this effort to intimidate the federal workforce, to make them say, I just don't want to do this anymore. And there are so many people who, we need to be employed by the federal government to do really important things. This just seems counterproductive.
Yeah, it's interesting. We need to limit expenses. We have to pull back on the spending of government. So then the question becomes, how do you do that? Where do you do that? There's no silver bullet to this. I think a lot of people want to make sure that whatever spending that's being done is being done in a credible fashion, and that waste is limited, right? And we saw
no one disagrees. No one disagrees with that.
But we saw this in the private sector, right? We saw this in
Sure.
the private sector, and we had a lot of companies who arguably had a lot of fat, and a lot of them were tech companies. And I'm not saying that this is a perfect application to government jobs. I'm just simply, I think, mentioning where this maybe could have germinated. And, you had these gourmet cafeterias serving, like ridiculous foods and lunches every day, regardless of how many employees were showing up. And a lot of that food was being thrown out and wasted. And a lot of real estate space was being wasted. And companies, were downsizing in that sense. And I think it is what is happening with the government right now is representative of the same thing that happened with the private sector, for better or worse, where the idea of the empathetic employer is something of the past, and I think it's just part of the new zeitgeist, if you will. And I'm not an advocate for it. I think it's just something we need to be aware of. I think it's just what is going on in our country right now, and it started with the private sector, and now it's working its way into government.
Right, but I also think that people who go into government to do, public service type jobs. They recognize that that the economics of working in government are never the same as working in private sector. And so people are making a sacrifice in terms of economics. And the exchange, honestly, is that these jobs have been, up till now, pretty safe. In other words, there aren't a lot of federal layoffs, and the benefits are good. In other words, you have a decent salary and good benefits.
Benefits are good, and a lot of them have pensions. And show me a private sector job that has a pension. So yeah, I think I think that's a very altruistic opinion that it's an idealistic, right? Like that's what we hope an individual goes into government for.
Well, I think, and I think, in fact, when you see the people who choose that, well, look, in every organization, there are bad actors. I mean, I guess part of it too is that, some of the things that Elon is doing work very well in the private sector. Okay. And if you're wrong, okay, and you destroy the company, then the company goes out of business. But if you're wrong and you destroy the federal government, then it's going to take years to rebuild. I mean, one of the things about firing probationary workers, I mean, look, it makes sense, again, from a management consultant perspective, because those people have less rights under the laws to the extent that they're willing to follow the laws. But a lot of these people are young, new people who have made a decision to dedicate themselves to public service, and you're throwing those people out. They're never going to come back because having been through this experience, they're never going to want to come back. And what you're left with is the older workers that are probably the target. If you're looking for the lazy federal worker, go a little deeper in the organization. So they're not getting at that. And because stuff has to get done. You can't, like, there's this concept of, well, why does the federal government why do we need a Department of Education? Why do we need an EPA? Why do we need, USAID? It's like, well, first of all, legally, the Congress said we want that. And from a policy perspective, they all have missions. And by the way, presidents, since time immemorial, change missions, but don't necessarily say, the mission is so not necessary that we're just dumping it.
Yeah, patronage is something that I think nobody likes to see. I think it first started with Andrew Jackson, most prominently, coming in and basically just putting in all of his cronies into government jobs. And then anytime after that we would have a new president, you'd see a complete turnover in the entire government. And thankfully, this practice was put to an end. We got to the point where we are with the present situation, where we are today. So it's like we want our government to function, but we want it to function efficiently, and we want it to function under the guidelines of the Constitution, where, hey, at the end of the day, anybody could argue to the cows come home whether this is a good tactic or not. I think from a strategy perspective, everyone agrees we don't want to see waste. We want to see efficiency. We know we have to make cuts somewhere. I'm not saying where they should be. I think everybody agrees with that concept. Then the question is where, like we were talking about. But I think most importantly with this topic is whether you agree with the tactic or not, the legislative part of it falls to Congress. This is nullification done by the president. And we've seen plenty of times in the past where nullification was an issue by federal laws and there was nullification by the states. But now we're seeing almost the opposite, where we have these, like the executive branch that is, for all intents and purposes, applying nullification to another body of government.
Right. And that other body of government, the Congress, because, both houses are controlled by the Republicans. And right now, the Republican Party has kind of put their lot in with Donald Trump, that you're seeing very little opposition from Congress. Although, it's interesting. What we saw in the last week was a series of sort of town hall meetings. The members are home at the moment, and they're getting an earful. They're getting an earful from their constituents. And I think that's where some of this begins to sort of unravel.
Why doesn't the Trump administration try to do this the quote unquote the right way through Congress, especially when you've got a small window where you've got some political capital, you're just coming into office, you've got this political capital, you have a Republican House and Senate. Now, granted, you don't have the supermajority to get some of this legislation passed, but why not? Why not just do it the way it's supposed to be done?
Well, right. I mean, I think part of it is that their strategy was to break a lot of things quickly, and that I think the courts are going to slow them down. But then that becomes, again, a place to negotiate from. which is, see, we don't, we went a couple of months without the USAID and the world didn't come to an end. So, see, we don't really, Congress, you're right. It's your decision, not my decision. But I showed you something. So, see, we're doing okay without it.
Well, speaking of negotiating and tying things up in the courts, thankfully, Governor Shapiro had a nice victory against the Trump administration. And it seemed like it might have been part of a negotiation too. What do you think? And maybe give a little backstory there for
Yeah,
people
I
here
think,
not hearing
so it's interesting. Normally when a state has to defend itself, the attorney general brings that case. In this case, Dave Sunday, a Republican, sort of said to the governor, look, I can't bring that case because, frankly, I'm a Republican,
Sunday being the Pennsylvania Attorney General.
Pennsylvania Attorney General. So I said, I can't bring that case, but you can bring that case, and I will delegate that case to you. They brought that case along with other attorney generals and it actually has resulted in an injunction, or at least a temporary injunction. But also at the same time, Governor Shapiro allowed himself to be part of a bipartisan commission of governors, so doing something for the Trump administration. And I think Josh is a very smart guy, and he recognizes that and he is a centrist, so he believes that the best way to solve problems are often from the middle. And so apparently this week there was the governor's meeting in Washington, and apparently he was with senior officials and said, listen, I'm going to do this thing for the president, but you have to do something for me. And by the way, I sued you, and I'd rather not sue you. I'd rather you just uphold your legal obligation to send us the money that Congress appropriated to Pennsylvania.
$2 billion, by the way.
Yeah,
$2 billion
yeah,
of funding. Yeah, so it's interesting. Thankfully, the money was freed up. It's coming back to Pennsylvania. We mentioned before, a lot of this funding is going towards all sorts of projects. A lot of them, like dealing with old mines and making sure they're not polluting the water system, capping those mines, having them done in an environmentally friendly way. And obviously, like the water system that goes into Pennsylvania's drinking water is incredibly important. So making sure that it's not polluted, I think, is top of mind and important, critical for everybody. But they did stop a few of the greener, quote unquote, parts of the funding. What were they, Eric?
right. Those were like charging stations. Some of the stuff that came out of the Biden, the infrastructure bill that had all the green stuff in it. So that stuff's still frozen.
So like charging stations, stuff like that.
Charging stations is one of the things that's been held up. So and it's interesting because the governor, he announced yesterday that it was all taken care of, all the money's flowing, and then today they said, well, we got most of the money, so we're not quite done yet.
Hey, we'll give Governor Shapiro, let's give Josh his victory lap, right?
No. I think he's a very effective governor, and I think, look, navigating Donald Trump is tricky. That leads us to our next topic, which is Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky and how the two of them are trying to navigate each other. It's really, if you're an American history buff, if you're a world history buff, there's something about, the United Nations has only been around for 75 years, but to have a resolution where the United States, Russia, and North Korea are on one side and the rest of the free world's on the other side,
it's shocking, right? You're like, wait a minute. I heard the report, I think on NPR was the first place I heard it. I was like scratching my head. I was like, am I hearing this right? So this might be the first time in history that the U.S., Russia, and North Korea,
right? This is the axis of evil. In other words, George W. Bush gave a famous speech when he was president about the axis of evil, and it was like Russia and North Korea and Iran.
Right.
I'm sure Iran voted for it too. I didn't see the total,
but Iraq was maybe involved in that. But yeah, so basically insert the U.S. for the new member of the axis of evil.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
and what it was is it literally the issue is that the United States was unwilling to go on the record to blame the war on Russia.
What's Really interesting is that there are a decent amount of Americans that I think subscribe to that belief.
I know, but you know what? Like the 2020 election, Rafe, it's just not true.
Yeah,
Just the tangible facts. You can make the argument that Ukraine was playing footsie with NATO and created a situation where Russia felt they had no choice than to invade Ukraine because Ukraine was going to become a NATO nation. I mean like you just can't blame. I mean that's such revisionist history. The truth is Vladimir Putin does not, Ukraine was trying to be a free, independent European republic, and that was a threat to Vladimir Putin.
yeah. It's like when you ask yourself which possible truth has more validity or is more likely, um, usually it's the simplest is the most is actually the most true or the most likely to be true. And it's like what do we think is more true, that NATO and the UN are part of a Western belief system and Western governments that band together to generally promote Western democracy and have kept a world order intact since World War II, with the United States being at the head of it. And while, yes, the US does pay more than its fair share into those entities and has the biggest military, acting as the police force of the world most of the time when it makes sense for various reasons. Is that true? Or do you have this evil cabal of the UN and NATO, and it's really just these old world European aristocracies that have controlled the world order for generations and trying to take more land from Russia? And this is just NATO expansion, and they're trying to paint Russia in a corner all the time, all the while the US pays the bill for European expansion into the East. It's
I mean, look, all these countries that were part of the Soviet Union were independent countries before the Soviet Union.
right. So do they deserve the chance to have self-determination and their own
Right.
governments?
I mean, like the goal. I mean, I think the goal for democracy, American freedom, is that every country, every country should have the right to determine its own outcome. Okay, and that means that if the Russians want to have, or the Chinese want to have a communist system, and that's what the people want, then that's okay. I mean, it's not necessarily what we want, but we think that self determination and freedom is a better way, and we're willing to support countries that say, "I want to be free," and that's
But so the argument would be that this was like a puppet government that was supported by the US and maybe even US aid, right? Probably
right.
goes back to that. And these are the organizations that need to be dismantled. They're corrupt. Even though it's in the name of Western democracy, they are supporting like puppet regimes. And it's just an extension of the West and capitalism. Maybe even this election would have gone a different way in the Ukraine had the US and the CIA or USAID, whatever nefarious forces you want to say were involved. Would that election have gone a different way? And when President Trump says statements like, it's Zelensky is a dictator and he's just a comedian, not even a good comedian, right? And that the Ukraine is essentially a vassal state, it speaks to that deeper conspiracy theory. And I think, like when people like Dan Bongino are now made the associate director of the FBI, and you see the other appointees in the Trump cabinet and appointees in other organizations, and the desire to dismantle all these world government bodies and US organizations that play significant roles around the world, we are literally witnessing the destruction of what was the world order.
Well, you certainly hope not, but it's not hyperbole to say some of the things that happened this week and things that were said this week undermines 80 years of foreign policy in the United States.
I don't think that's hyperbole at all. I think we're literally witnessing a paradigm shift, a sea change, if you will, where the theme is going from globalization to maybe regional hegemons at best. And I mean, hey, if that's going to be the case, if the world is going to be sectioned off into we might want to play a little nicer with our directly adjacent neighbors like Canada and Mexico. If this is the way it's going to unfold, those all of a sudden become very critical trade partners.
Yeah, look, there is some really weird stuff going on, and we'll see. Like the interesting aspect of Trump and beating up on Ukraine is coming to the table to sign an agreement to provide some minerals to the United States as compensation for the support.
And it's questionable if these rare earth minerals even exist in
Right.
Ukraine for the propensity that they do. Yeah, I mean, everybody, rare earth minerals have been the buzzword ever since COVID, right? And supply chain management and China having almost close to a monopoly on these and how important they are to everything from the microchips and silicon to like making sure our military functions efficiently. But I mean, is Ukraine the answer? I mean, I know there's like a lot of natural gas allegedly that's in the Donbas region, and whether these rare earth minerals exist or not. So let's just.
And are we even going to get no? And the Donbas region even going to be part of Ukraine when an eventual peace deal is negotiated?
Who knows? Because apparently that's where the quote unquote Zelensky Nazis were committing genocide against Russian forces. I say that in quotes for anybody not watching, because these were some of the accusations that were made early on in the Ukraine conflict, which just passed 3 years.
This week.
Which is crazy to think about. Yeah, this week. But let's just pretend for a second that we know the natural gas exists, and that's a very critical resource, especially for Europe. And let's just pretend that in addition to the natural gas, these rare earth minerals exist, and we know that they're important to have for the U.S. Does that mean, Eric, that all of a sudden the U.S. military and funding is to the highest bidder for anybody in the world that has minerals that the U.S. needs or wants? The U.S. military is essentially like mercenaries for hire. Are we going back in time to
the Prussians,
King George III
hiring the Prussians
and the Prussians
right.
to fight against the U.S. or the revolution?
This is not Rafe. I mean, again, not hyperbole. I mean, that's certainly what it looks like this week, where the president of the United States has basically shaken down Ukraine for billions of dollars and resources in exchange for our help. When, frankly, our help helps us. Well, two things. One is the money we're giving to Ukraine is not being given to Ukraine. The money we're giving Ukraine is being given to, for the most part, U.S. defense contractors who are building weapons and sending them to Ukraine. And Ukraine is fighting, for lack of a word, the proxy war to control, to sort of limit Vladimir Putin's expansion plans. And no American soldiers have been injured in this 3-year bloody war. I mean, it's a great investment, but the president is a deal maker, and he wants to say, "Look what I got."
He is a deal maker, and it's not lost on me, or I'm sure any other aficionados or people who appreciate history, that this deal was cut in Munich, and in the not too distant past, the last time an aggressive dictator and regime who was looking to expand into Europe, the last time that that particular leader was appeased, the way that this particular leader is being appeased, the deal was also cut in Munich. So
yep.
History has a funny way of not necessarily repeating itself, but rhyming, and it certainly seems to be rhyming in this case.
I agree. I think that's something that people are going to have. And I think, look, the other message is just, don't tune out. Keep paying attention. If your government is doing something that offends you, say something, do something, be active,
And
because
totally,
that's
Those are wise words, Eric, and I will piggyback them by saying if what President Trump is doing to test you and you think is awful and the exact opposite of your beliefs, I would encourage you to read people who are pro-Trump and arguing that what he's doing is the right thing. And if you already agree that what President Trump is doing is the right thing, I would encourage you to read opposite views of why maybe it's not the best thing to do. And ideally, you're reading opinions from both sides of the fence and you're able to form your own opinion. Because we, myself included, Eric included, we have a tendency as a society to live in an echo chamber, and it's nice to feel validated to say, oh, well, this is what I believe. Let me just find people that, groupthink. Let me find people that just agree with my thinking. And hey, it's all about those dopamine hits, right? Like when we're online and reading articles or on social media and you find something and it's a little nugget of knowledge and it's like, hey, I believe in that. That's what I think. It literally feels good. We get some nice dopamine hits with that. But I think the critical thinking aspect of that is to pause and to say, wait a minute, let me look at the opposing view. Let me look at some different opinions and maybe even reshape my opinion. Because whether you voted for Trump or not doesn't mean he's always going to be right, and it doesn't mean he's always going to be wrong.
But he is our president, and this is our country, and he's leading it right now. And as citizens, we need to pay attention.
We do indeed. We do indeed. Well, Eric, maybe this is a good time for me to raise my glass to you and to our listeners and to say thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to us. Please do please do follow, please do leave comments. It's incredibly helpful for us if you're going to subscribe and to leave comments and to like our page, whether you are watching, listening on YouTube, or now we're available on Apple and soon to be available on Spotify.
Great. Thanks, Rafe.
Thanks, Eric.
We'll see everybody soon.
Great to see you.